All right, hi everyone, Cliff here. We're going to talk about risk management planning. All right, so there's the presentation. So even the most carefully planned project can run into trouble. No matter how well you plan your project, you can always encounter members getting sick or quitting, resources that you were depending on turn out to be unavailable, even the weather can throw you out for a loop. So does that mean you're helpless against unknown problems? Absolutely not. You can risk planning to identify potential problems that could cause trouble for your project, analyze how likely they are to occur, take action to prevent the risks you can avoid, and minimize the ones you can't. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about the definition and importance of risk management, 4 ways how to handle risks, a little bit about the risk management process, and then we're going to talk about project risk by phases. So let's start with the definition. So a risk is any uncertain event or condition that might affect your project. Key thing here is not all risks are negative. Some events, like finding an easier way to do an activity, or conditions like lowering prices for certain materials, can help your project. When this helps, we call it an opportunity, but it's still handled just like a risk. A good example of this is we had COVID happen during our project at the airport with no passengers. A risk, obviously, of a global disease you would think would be a terrible thing for our work. It actually sped it up, right? We were ahead of budget and schedule because, again, the pandemic shut the airport down. We were able to do lots of work. So it was a very, very outside risk of it happening. However, it ended up being positive and not a negative. There are no guarantees on any project. Even the simplest activity can turn into unexpected problems. Anything that might occur to change the outcome of a project activity, we call that a risk. A risk can be an event, like a snowstorm, or it can be a condition, like an important part being unavailable. Either way, it's something that may or may not happen. But if it does, then it will force you to change the way you and your team work on the project. So when you're planning a project, risks are still uncertain. They haven't happened yet, but eventually some of the risks that you plan for do happen, and that's when you have to deal with them. There are 4 basic ways to handle a risk. Number 1, avoid it. The best thing you can do with a risk is avoid it. If you can prevent it from happening, it definitely won't hurt your project. The easiest way to avoid this risk is to walk away from the cliff, but that may not be an option on this project. Number 2, mitigate. If you can't avoid the risk, you can mitigate it. This means taking some sort of action that will cause it to do as little damage to your project as possible. The next is transfer. So one effective way to deal with the risk is to pay someone else to accept it. The most common way to do this is to buy insurance. You're transferring the risk of an accident instead of you paying everything. Say an example of car insurance, you're unloading that risk to the car insurance company. The last one is accepting the risk. When you can't avoid, mitigate, or transfer risk, then you have to accept it. But even when you accept a risk, at least you've looked at all the alternatives and you know what will happen if it occurs. If you can't avoid the risk and there's nothing you can do to reduce its impact, then accepting it is your only choice. By the time a risk actually occurs on your project, it's too late to do anything about it. That's why you need to plan for risks from the beginning and keep coming back to do more planning throughout the project. So there's a few more definitions that are typically used when defining risks. One is risk appetite, so the degree of uncertainty an entity is willing to take on and in anticipation of reward. The next is risk tolerance, so the degree or amount or volume of risk that an organization or individual will withstand. And the last is risk threshold, the point above which a stakeholder or organization is no longer willing to accept the level of uncertainty or impact. As a project manager, you will have to identify in yourself what level of appetite, tolerance, and threshold you have, but also recognize as a project manager, you will also have to consider the stakeholder organization that you're working with. What are their thresholds, their tolerances and appetites? Because if theirs are lower than yours, you will have to adapt and go to their point. Whereas if theirs are way higher than yours, you have to be comfortable with having that much more level of risk. So let's look at a little example. So before paint can be applied, the surface must be cleaned. So we're looking at a room and we're going to be painting. Toxic chemicals are one method of cleaning. So the risk, someone may injure their skin or their eyes due to a spill or splash of the chemical. Here are the options. Do we avoid it? Find another method of cleaning. Would high pressure water work as well? Could a longer delay for curing be considered? Is painting really necessary? In this specific option, this is pretty normal in the finishing stages of construction. If there's occupants in the building and you're still doing construction on it, when you're going to be painting, those fumes can get in the ventilation system and it will likely cause them harm. One of the ways to obviously avoid painting, say during the day, is you could do it at night, so that when people go home, you paint, and that way the fumes are in the ventilation system, they clear out by the morning. The second option might be transferring, right? So again, getting back to our painting, get insurance on the workers. If toxic exposure is based on time limits, use a larger workforce for shorter time. An unethical method sometimes used is outsourced internationally. The next is reducing the probability of injury. So require protective equipment such as clothing and safety goggles and masks. Provide training and information to the workers. So in this, we're taking on the risk ourselves, and we're going to try to alleviate some of that risk to the people by making them wear PPE. Others, reduce the degree of impact of possible injury, so ensure that on-site first aid and attendants are available, eye wash stations, etc. So as we're thinking through these risks, we're trying to reduce that harm to the individual. Last is we accept and do nothing. Now the accept part, these usually happen at home. You're going to be doing some sort of renovation, and for whatever reason, you put yourself in harm's way instead of, on a job site where you have to think of everybody and you're reducing those risks. Really, we should be doing reducing risk for everything, but it is very common just to accept it and move on. So a way that we can kind of look at these risks is something with a risk management plan. So creating a risk management plan will help you identify how you're going to handle risks in your project. It documents how you'll assess risks, who is responsible for doing it, and how often you'll do risk planning. Some risks are technical, like a component that might turn out to be difficult to use. Others are external, like changes in the market, or even problems with the weather. It's important to come up with guidelines to help you figure out how big a risk's potential impact could be. The impact tells you how much damage the risk would cause to your project. Many projects classify impact on a scale from minimal to severe, or even from very low to very high. Your risk management plan should give you a scale to help figure out the probability of the risk. Some risks are very likely, others are not. Managing risks on projects is a process that includes risk assessment and a mitigation strategy for those risks. Risk assessment includes both the identification of potential risk and the evaluation of the potential impact of the risk. A risk mitigation plan is designed to eliminate or minimize the impact of the risk events, occurrences that have a negative impact on the project. Identifying risk is both a creative and a disciplined process. The creative process includes brainstorming sessions where the team is asked to create a list of everything that could go wrong. All ideas are welcome at this stage, with the evaluation of the ideas coming later. Identifying the sources of risk by category is another method for exploring potential risk on a project. Some examples of categories for potential risks include the following. So we have technical risks, cost risks. So again, with technical risks, it could be the degree of difficulty someone needs to learn to do something. With costs, it can be that obviously costs fluctuate with the market. That's one. With schedule, getting something on time, having a schedule overlapping, those sorts of things. Client risks, so if you have a supplier and that client, say, drops out, that's a potential risk. Contractual, likely in Canada, your contractual risks are still hopefully protected by the contract. If you're in a contract, you may have a risk of either losing that contract or someone not abiding by the contract. If you do work in construction, weather is always going to be an issue, especially through the winter. Financial risks can happen both internally, so the project loses money, loses funding, and it has to stop. Political risk, again, if your project is a government project, and a changeover of leadership. Sometimes that money can be pulled and the project stops. There can be environmental risk, which is harming the environment can be one option. And then people risks. Obviously, in today's age, we have to be very culturally and aware of everyone around us to make sure that the project can work without issues arising. For risk identification, you can use the same framework as the work breakdown structure, or WBS, for developing a risk breakdown structure. So a risk breakdown structure organizes the risks that have been identified into categories using a table with increasing levels of detail. The people category can be subdivided into different types of risks associated with people. After the potential risks have been identified, the project team then evaluates each risk based on the probability that a risk event will occur and the potential loss associated with it. Not all risks are equal. Some risk events are more likely to happen than others, and the cost of a risk can vary greatly. Evaluating the risk for probability of occurrence and the severity or the potential losses to the project is the next step in the risk management process. There is a positive correlation, both increase or decrease together, between project risk and project complexity. A project with new and emerging technology will have a high complexity rating and a correspondingly high risk. The project management team will assign the appropriate resources to the technology managers to ensure the accomplishment of project goals. The more complex the technology, the more resources the technology manager typically needs to meet the project goals, and each of those resources could face unexpected problems. Same thing happens in new building construction. If you're working in something like a hospital, there's a lot of regulations, so the risks that are going to be associated with something like a hospital job is going to be much, much higher, because obviously it's going to have an impact on the end user, which will be patients, than something like a home design, where it's pretty straightforward. The building codes are quite clear. Something like a hospital, there's a lot more regulations involved, which means the complexity is going to be a lot more difficult, which usually means the risks are going to be higher to get it right. So risk register, this is a document that's created during the planning phase, and it contains the list of identified risks, list of potential responses. Over the life of the project, it will add updates to probabilities of the risk occurring, information on occurrences, if any, information on actual responses, and the success or lack of success of those responses. So again, the risk register happens during that planning phase. After the risk has been identified and evaluated, the project team develops a risk mitigation plan, which is a plan to reduce the impact of an expected event. The project team mitigates risks in various ways. Risk avoidance usually involves developing an alternative strategy that has a higher probability of success, but usually at a higher cost associated with accomplishing a project task. There's risk sharing, so it involves partnering with others to share the responsibility for the risky activities. Typically, this is by purchasing insurance. You're sharing the risk with the insurance company. Risk reduction is an investment of funds to reduce the risk on a project. On international projects, companies will often purchase the guarantee of a currency rate to reduce the risk associated with fluctuations in the currency exchange rate. A risk reduction on a normal construction project could be you can invest in a safety officer, right? So someone that's always there to make sure that everyone's following the safety plans. That would be an option for risk reduction. Risk transfer is a risk reduction method that shifts the risk from the project to another party, an example, insurer. The project team often develops an alternative method for accomplishing a project goal when a risk event has been identified that may frustrate the accomplishment of the goal. These plans are called contingency plans. Contingency funds, like we learned about in assignment 3, are funds set aside by the project team to address unforeseen events that cause the project costs to increase. Projects with high risk profile will typically have a large contingency budget, although the amount of contingency allocated in the project budget is a function of the risks identified in the risk analysis process. Contingency is typically managed as one line item in the project budget. So let's look at controlling risk. So throughout the project manager must continue to update the risk register as new risks are identified, and the project requires consideration of risks that are no longer possible. Risk assessments and risk audits can be used to monitor and control the risk management processes. And finally, there are costs associated with the contingency reserve. So if it can be identified that some portion of this reserve can be released, it is a benefit to the organization and the project. So project risk by phase. Let's look at the initiation phase. So risk is associated with things that are unknown. More things are unknown at the beginning of a project, but risk must be considered in the initiation phase and weighed against the potential benefit of the project's success in order to decide if the project should be chosen. Once the project is approved and it moves into the planning stage, risks are identified with each major group of activities. A risk breakdown structure can be used to identify increasing levels of detailed risk analysis. As the project progresses and more information becomes available to the project team, the total risk on the project typically reduces as activities are performed without loss. The risk plan needs to be updated with new information and risks checked off that are related to activities that have been. During the closeout phase, agreements for risk sharing and risk transfer need to be concluded and the risk breakdown structure examined to be sure all the risk events have been avoided or mitigated. Final estimate of loss due to risk can be made and recorded as part of other project documentation. So just looking at the summary of this, we talked about the definition and the importance of risks. We talked about the 4 ways to handle risks. We looked at the risk management process, and we looked at project risks by phases. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me about this one or obviously get a hold of me on Teams. I do have a little example here about the Green Oasis Park, right? This project's going to be going throughout our different modules. So if you recall with the Green Oasis project, it's a project they're creating a park. So let's look at our risk management plan they might create. So measuring risk, a useful exercise to compare risks is the following. So assign a value. So for example, 1 to 5 for the impact a risk will have on a project, and also assign a value, example 1 to 5, of the likelihood a risk will occur during the project. Multiply both these metrics together to get a risk score. The higher the number, the worse this risk would be to the project. So for example, 5 in the impact would be severe, so it's going to have a major impact on the final project. A 1 in likelihood, for example, yeah, it might happen once in a while, but not that frequent. Let's look at something like a risk with weather delays during construction, right? So the probability is likely moderate for weather delays. If you remember, the project's going to start in the spring. It's a lot of ground and earthwork, right? So it's not going to be a wintertime project. So it's going to be a moderate time. There's going to be some rain, which will likely have to shut down some of the construction project that's going to be going on. The impact of weather is likely going to be high. If you're going to be, removing soil or moving soil, there's going to be a lot of mud traction. If you're going to have excavators and that sort of thing, it's going to make a big mess. So the weather delays during construction, it's likely going to be about a 15. If we take 3 times 5, 15. It's not as high as, say, a 25, which would be the maximum worst score, but it is a relatively high score. It's kind of in the middle. And if we were look to kind of mitigate this, we can monitor weather forecasts and obviously plan the work plan the work accordingly. We incorporate buffer time in the construction schedule for potential delays, and we also use weather-resistant construction materials. With terms of the grass and those sorts of things, they are weather-resistant. It's more the impact of the construction equipment itself I can see as being an issue. Let's look at a risk like budget constraints leading to reduced quality. Overall, I scored this probably as low. All right, the Green Oasis project was quite a lower cost project. So the chances of it not meeting budget constraints, so going over budget, is likely pretty low. All right, it's a pretty straightforward project, not a lot of crazy infrastructure. The impact of this would be a 5, so meaning that if costs, if the budget was greatly reduced, the severity of this project, say, going under, is probably quite high. So I scored it at a 5. So the way we can mitigate that, the overall score is a 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. The score would be a 5. So it's not as high of a risk as weather. And again, these scores are kind of subjective. So you could score it higher than I could. But looking at what Green Oasis project is about, I feel like this would be about right. That likely this project would go ahead. It's a very short timeline, something that a lot of the community would want. So really, it's a lower score is probably practical. But anyways, to reduce this, we could regularly review and update the project budget, prioritize spending based on critical project elements, and seek additional funding sources if necessary. So chances of really going over budget on this project, probably not very likely. Let's look at stakeholder conflicts or resistance. So probably of this happening where someone would say resist something in the project, I gave it a moderate. All right, in a big city, in a city type park project, there's likely people that will stand up to something like this type of creation. So I gave it a moderate score. If a stakeholder is to have a problem, it's likely going to delay the schedule, which will have a high impact on what the work is. So I scored this at a 5 and a total score of 15. So this is a pretty moderate risk. That's something to be worried about. And the way we can mitigate this is conduct regular stakeholder meetings, usually in that planning stage, to make sure that nothing gets impacted during the execution phase. Clearly communicate the project benefits to gain support, and develop a comprehensive stakeholder engagement plan. So make sure that people are engaged the entire time through. Another risk is project timeline deviation, right? So this could be something where the project gets run off track by some reason. In a lot of projects, this would be scored at a moderate, where especially if you have a tight deadline, this would maybe scored as a 5, as a really high likelihood. The impact usually of project timeline deviations, for this one, I score it as a 5. It could probably be a little bit lower, like in a outdoor park project. If you have a deviation on the timeline, it's an empty space, so it could probably score a little bit lower than a 5, maybe even a 3. Total score is about a 15. So again, it's a moderate risk that we have to consider that this thing could happen. The way we can get around project timeline deviations, we regularly review and update the project schedule, implement agile project management methodologies. So thinking about sequencing work to make sure that we're on the same. If something can't be done, something else can be doing concurrently. And communicate clearly with the project team and stakeholders about any potential delay. So that way we can keep scheduling the work to keep going. Something that's important with these sorts of steps is it's good to have multiple people score these sorts of things, so that it's not just you thinking, oh, this is definitely something that's really high. Someone else might be like, no, this is really not a big thing. This is a really clear project. Don't worry about it. They might score it less. And then you can take the average of the score and then figure out how overall likelihood is this going to be a risk for the project. All right, this is our last example. So this is a skilled labor shortage or contractor issues. I scored this probability as a moderate, about a 3, and the impact was also moderate, around 3, so total score of 9. Again, this is a landscaping type work. If I'm thinking locally, we do have a good amount of people that can do landscaping, so it's probably a lesser type risk. It's not very high complexity work, doing park projects, so likely this one is going to be a lower score than some of the other things that might occur. But if we have to worry about this, again, we can think about establishing contracts with reliable contractors, make sure that they're going to show up and their work's good, maintain good relationship with local labor unions, and have contingency plans in place for labor shortages. Right? So these are some of the ways that we can think about how to avoid these risks. In this PowerPoint, there's a bunch of quiz questions. Again, I hope these examples help you practice for the quiz that's coming up. And yeah, if you have any questions about this presentation, please let me know.